I'm here with Tim Anderson. Tim, congratulations on your new book, The Dirty War on Syria.
Thank you.
Yep. So Tim is also a member of Hands Off Syria, which is a group that is aimed at stopping international intervention in the Syrian war, also exposing international aggression against Syria. So, Tim, you're an academic specialized in South America. Why have you gotten this interest in Syria?
I think because the Latin American experience is very strongly linked to intervention by the big power, and the dirty wars and coups and so on, the invasions have been, until the last 15 years of wars in the Middle East, it's really been Latin America that's been subject to this more. There was Iran in the 1950s, of course, but there are strong parallels between the Latin American recent history with Washington and the Middle East.
I actually wrote an opinion piece a couple days ago called Undermining Democracy, the Politics of Perception. One thing that I was writing a piece earlier this semester, and Professor Noam Chomsky gave me some sources. He gave me one source by the LA essay, which was an examination of the elections, the 1984 elections in Nicaragua, and it reminded me kind of the 2012 election in Syria, where the Americans and the West claimed that the elections in Nicaragua were rigged, when in fact the opposition groups, including Arturo Cruz, actually were compelled by Washington to not participate, and the Syrian rebels did the same thing in 2012. Do you think that it's kind of the same strategy?
Yeah, it's coming from the same strategic interests. I mean, you could add to that the opposition in Venezuela back in 2005. They refused to participate. Now, they won in the National Assembly just recently, but when a group like that, so-called opposition, in the case of Syria, it's not very much to do with Syrians because the opposition is so foreign-dominated. But in those sort of situations, they're looking for some clearly non-democratic way out. They're looking for a coup. They're looking for some sort of military intervention that's going to save them. And that, of course, destroys normal politics in a country, basically, because there's always the expectation. And this has been a long history in Latin America, including the coup in Chile in 1973 and so on, that there's an expectation that the big power is going to intervene and support them, whatever they do, whichever undemocratic, violent, terrorist action they revert to, the big power will save them.
Right. So, what do you think about these Geneva talks that are about to take place? So Zehran Alouche was going to be there. He got killed on Christmas. His brother Muhammad is there, and he's gone on record calling al-Nusra his brothers and so on. What do you think about his inclusion into these talks?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting because it's bringing things out in the open, isn't it? In a way, what's been called the moderate opposition for a long time is now being led by, the Islamic Front. The distinction of the Islamic Front, which was sort of an umbrella group when the old FSA and Fruit Brigade collapsed, is that it's always worked very closely with the other Islamic elements of the old brigades, Ahrar al-Sham and Jabhat al-Nusra, the official al-Qaeda, of course. They are, of course, extreme sectarians. They have bombed Damascus every day for the last 3 years, pretty much, with mortars and rockets and so on, into a huge city of 8 million people. They're sectarian in the extreme. They believe in the extermination, quote unquote, of minorities in Syria. So I'd like to see any other of the moderate opposition that the US supports that does not believe in the genocide against minorities in Syria, because this is much more in the open now that the US has put its weight behind particular groups. They've refused to nominate particular groups in the past. So of course, they have no interest in any sort of political negotiation or democratic participation because they'll be annihilated. They'll have minimal support in Syria. They won't get any sort of support. So they're always looking for some sort of intervention or military option. They're losing on that front now. And of course, Russia is bringing in some other players into the picture there. But I think that it's a sort of a charade that has to be gone through this Geneva process, because ultimately, as they have recognized in principle in the first Geneva process, in the process in Vienna and Moscow, it's the Syrian people that are going to decide on this. And that means the Syrian people, through their constitution, through their voting power and so on, are going to decide on that. and the extreme Islamists have never had any interest in that.
Do you think that the rebel groups actually have a unified vision for Syria, or because recently there's been conflicts between the groups in Idlib, for example? It seems to me that their mission it's totally scattered. They don't actually have a plan, all of them together. Do you think that they do have some common goal other than just getting rid of Assad?
I think ideologically they're fairly united, but the problem is they're united in a sectarian vision of an Islamist state. And that vision, that extreme sectarianism, of course, leads to disputes in itself. That is to say, sectarians never go on with sectarians. I believe, for example, the Deobandis of South Asia don't like the Salafis of the Gulf, but to the outside of that, they appear to have similar sorts of views. But I think what's more behind the disputes between these groups when they occasionally kill each other is that their funders have had some differences in the past. In the past, there were some differences between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. That's to some extent reconciled. But I think strategically the funders have also not wanted them to get together, basically. I think the fact that ISIS and Al-Nusra did not merge some years back has a lot to do with the fact that they want to contain the size of their Frankenstein monsters, They don't want something that gets so big that it will compete with them. It would get out of the hands of the Saudis if they had a big united group and would move against the Saudis. Whereas if they've got the Islamic Front, Al-Nusra, ISIS, which all have the same ideology, they're competing for funds and arms and power and so on like that. But it's better for the controlling bodies, the puppet masters like the Saudis and the Turks, Erdogan, to have them rather separate and friction between them because they don't really want them to get too big.
So it's almost like it makes them compete for funding, and it makes it so they can't be big enough to overthrow their financiers, right?
Absolutely. Remember there was an attempted coup in the Emirates just recently, and the UAE arrested about 40 people and put them in Al-Qaeda types and put them in jail. So there's a real danger of a backlash, particularly on the Gulf monarchies. And the Saudis have always been aware of this. And the Saudis, for that reason, they never trusted the Muslim Brotherhood because the Muslim Brotherhood's very well organised. It's the best organised of the Syrian opposition. It's been banned for a long time, of course, but they have never trusted the Brotherhood because they see the Brotherhood, although they share Salafi goals, they see the Brotherhood as a competitor and could, not get rid of their dependence on Saudi money and be a threat to the Saudis themselves.
So back on the topic of your book, to my knowledge, your book is the first complete research on exposing the propaganda and international agendas in the Syrian war. Why do you think your work is so important?
I think I wrote this book because there was such a lack of coherent discussions of the Syrian conflict. Everything that had been done in English language, at least since 2011, was really very much trying to position itself against the Western agenda. There's been a number of books written, including about Hezbollah and about Syria and about the regional conflict, but it's always with reference to trying to ingratiate themselves to some extent with the Western regime change agenda, basically. So I think in many respects the book, I hope it'll be a resource for other people. I don't think it's not really written directly for the general Western audience because the general Western audience now their minds have been tainted so much with 5 years of Western propaganda that it's difficult for them to understand some of these, what I call existential myths, the existential myth that Washington is involved in a war on ISIS, for example. It's very hard for a Western audience to believe that's simply completely false. So they have to be worked through it with evidence, I believe, with their better instincts or their better traditions, as I put it. There are some good Western traditions as well as bad Western traditions. And the good traditions are rationalism and use of evidence and ethical principle and so on. So I see it as a resource book that others might be able to use to say, well, you don't really appreciate what's going on with Washington and ISIS. Here's the evidence. Have a walk through the evidence and then come to a conclusion after, rather than just have an argument and say, this is the case or that's the case or the Illuminati says this or something. Walk through it with evidence and draw on some of the better traditions of Western thought. So,
at least it would get people talking about this subject. But along with the perception, I mean, the United States, Washington, has been no stranger to using white propaganda, whitewashing certain groups to rally public support.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a few notable features about the propaganda of the war on Syria, and one is the role of the corporate media and the state media, of course, but the other one is the creation of all of these, or the co-option of all of these NGOs, the human rights organisations, whether from the US side, and there's quite a number of them, or from the Islamist side. The Muslim Brotherhood networks have used quite a lot of these and have been quite successful, really, in making their sources, like the guy in England, the Syrian Observatory, pretty much, there for everything, a single source for everything, uncontradicted. It reflects on the media how they do that too. But so the creation of all of those artificial propaganda bodies has been a notable feature of this war, I think, because it's gone on for so long and it's attempted to maintain these illusions for so long. It's very difficult to maintain that illusion of, say, the war on ISIS, for example, when you have half a dozen Iraqi MPs saying, hey, they're directly delivering weapons to ISIS, and this is just blocked out, banned in the Western media. So there are some extraordinary contradictions in that whole propaganda war that are worth examining.
So, to that point, 2 podcasts ago, our guest, Professor Norman Finkelstein, actually Dr. Norman Finkelstein now, he kind of mentioned to what you're talking about, Kenneth Roth, for example. The figures that Human Rights Watch uses aren't necessarily incorrect, but it's the legal interpretations of those and kind of shaping the narrative with those statistics. It's what is kind of misleading. Would you agree with that?
I don't know exactly which figures he's talking about. If he's talking about the figures from the Syrian Observatory on Human Rights, I think they're absolutely worthless. I think that they're plucked out of the air, basically. Now, of course, there's a definitional issue there, which is that from the very beginning, as a US journalist, Nir Rosen, pointed out, there's always been this habit of the Brotherhood of saying all of their casualties are civilians, all of the people, and their revisionist history. For example, if we go back to the Muslim Brotherhood insurrection in Hama 34 years ago now, at the time US intelligence said that about 2,000 people were killed there, and most of them were Muslim Brotherhood and their associates. Now, these days, if you read in most of the Western media and the Western books these days, you'll hear it 30 or 40,000 civilians were killed there. So on the one hand, the insurrectionists in Hama were redesignated as civilians. On the other hand, the numbers were increased by a factor of from 2,000 to 40,000. And of course, the US intelligence was a genuinely independent source back in 1982 because they were helping fund that insurrection through Saddam Hussein, through the King of Jordan, through the Saudis and so on. So there is this tradition of calling dead Islamist fighters civilians on the one hand, but there's also the tradition of inflating the figures. So I wouldn't say it's just a definitional problem. It's also a question of, and this guy in England, Rami Abdul Rahman, comes up and says, Russian planes have killed 1,000 civilians in the last 4 months. Where does he get those figures from? Completely untrustworthy, completely partisan. The point I make in my book is that in traditional terms of assessing evidence, you can't accept sources who have a direct interest in the conflict. Here's this guy flying a flag for the defunct Free Syrian Army and saying, the other side's just killed 1,000 civilians. You simply cannot accept that at face value, however you twist it or change the definitions.
To that point, kind of, to the inception of this war, there's the general notion that it started because the Assad regime, as they call it, cracked down violently on peaceful protests. In your chapter, Daraa 2011, Another Islamic Insurrection, you challenge this view.
Yeah. Basically, I think now, fortunately, a few years on, we've got access to a lot of evidence about that. That was the thing that first attracted my interest to the conflict, really. How did this start in Daraa? Where did the violence begin in Daraa, or how did it begin in Daraa? Because I have experience with demonstrations and those sorts of things, and that level of violence, the snipers on the roof and so on, that doesn't just happen spontaneously in demonstrations, It shows a fair degree of organisation. So we know now the Saudis have come out and admitted that they funded Islamist groups around the Al-Omari Mosque in Daraa. And we know, in terms of the big picture, there were 2 things going on at once. There were demonstrations against the government, There were demonstrations for the government as well, but there was that level of demonstrations and protests and rallies. But there was also an Islamist insurrection in the middle of it. And the insurrection was clearly quite distinct from and drove off the streets those rallies. And I've spoken to a lot of people who were involved in those rallies and who supported those rallies at the time. But within a few weeks of the Islamist violence, they disappeared. And there's a number of well-documented case studies on this. There was a journalist up in Marat al-Numan up towards Aleppo who went to one rally with several thousand people, and the Islamists pulled out guns and started shooting police. And there was another rally, and there was a few hundred people there. So you can see the detailed anatomy of how those rallies in the early days disintegrated. And if you look at the composition of the opposition too, which one of the chapters in the books is about Bashar al-Assad and the reform movement, you would see that back in 2005, there was a document called the Damascus Declaration, which was the most comprehensive statement by opposition groups in Syria, and all of them, with the exception of even the Muslim Brotherhood agreed to it at this stage, but they were the first to break from it. All of them agreed that they did not want the reform movement to attack the army or attack the state. All of them. And it was only the Muslim Brotherhood and some exiles that really broke from that. So we know from looking at their stated principles, and they were very strongly anti-government and wanted all sorts of changes. Bashar, of course, delivered some of those changes later on in 2011, 2012. But it was really, they were very strongly supporting a unified state and a unified army. So the attacks on the army were not supported by the majority of the opposition. So there's a lot of evidence now to show that the reform movement, the rallies and so on were quite distinct from the Islamist insurrection that happened. And the Islamist insurrection was being planned well before that too, because arms were intercepted on the Iraqi border some weeks before and so on. There's a lot of evidence on it now.
Yeah, that's always something that I've kind of asked myself, and clearly I'm not the expert that you are, but I've kind of questioned to myself, how is it possible that all these groups were almost immediately armed? And certainly I think to your point about the protests, the Indian ambassador to Syria concurs with you on that because he had reported it. I saw it recently, but I think he reported at the time that there was busfuls of people being taken to Aleppo that would burn things and then they would leave later on.
Yeah. So there were parallel movements going on, basically. There was a genuine reform, and is a genuine reform movement. Most of them defected to the state, if not to the government. Some of them supported the government, like the Syrian Social National Party supported the government when the crisis began. Some of them more of them perhaps supported the state and the army than supported the government, because a lot of them were anti-Ba'athists in different sorts of ways. But most of that opposition is still there in Syria, supporting the state, a loyal opposition, if you like, because, they saw what was going on very rapidly, and the more experienced amongst them knew exactly what a Muslim Brotherhood insurrection was from the earlier experience.
So you mentioned evidence about the government not attacking its own civilians. You kind of explore that in Chapter 9, titled Chemical Fabrications, the Ghouta incident. I think maybe I butchered that a little bit. But why does the mythology of that incident persist today?
Because it's been repeated so many times. As you mentioned, Kenneth Roth before with his barrel bomb propaganda, just to repeat, using anything like using photos from Gaza to repeat barrel bombs, using the anniversary of the nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki to attack Assad for barrel bombs. The constant repetition of these things, the constant repetition of gassing children, chemical weapons against children, is what creates those new myths, more or less. And that's why I say it's difficult with Western audience who've been bombarded with this type of misinformation to simply negate it. You have to walk them through with evidence and show how it was false and why it was false and how they did it, basically. And that takes some time. It's that sort of propaganda, the repetition of a lie like that constantly. Still you'll find Wikipedia, for example, which is largely a reflection of the US media, will repeat most of those things there and sort of keep them in keep those myths going.
I've seen several examples of how Wikipedia uses Western or Israeli sources when talking about these incidents or organizations. Kind of to your point earlier though, about reform. So there was the 2012 referendum to allow parties outside the Ba'ath Party to run in elections. Recently, I ran a story that was given to us by our source in Damascus. He told us that, for example, Salman al-Assad, who killed that police officer, was actually given a 20-year prison sentence, and even this same week, they've laid off high-level government officials and some military officials, and all of this is an attempt to crack down on corruption in government, which I believe was one of the main concerns at the inception of this movement. Do you think the Syrian government has been taking on these public concerns very well?
I think Bashar as president has regained his support. Some analysts, like Camilo Tracci, for example, say that he lost a certain amount of support in the early days of the conflict, and a lot of the criticism that I heard and still hear sometimes from Syrians about Bashar is quite different to the Western criticism. They say they wish he was more like his father, that they think he was indecisive and not strong enough in the early days. But I think that he has learned a lot of lessons in this crisis, and one of them has been dismissing people who are accused of corruption. There's some ministers who have gone in recent times too, without a lot of publicity. But his relative who was jailed over the killing that you mentioned, that was a big test. I mean, people would have really resented it if there'd been a cronyism had crept in there and protected that cousin or second cousin of his, I believe, in that circumstance. On what you mentioned about the reform, there were a series of reforms, even in 2011. Even before 2011, other non-Ba'ath parties were getting into the National Assembly. One of the changes of 2012 did was to allow the competitive presidential election and remove the status of the Ba'ath Party there. But some of those parties were in Parliament since 2005 and came back in 2012 in the elections there. So, and we know from that process and from polls that the Ba'ath Party still maintains a fair degree of support, but it's less than the support for Bashar al-Assad. And probably Bashar al-Assad has less support than the Syrian army. So, in other words, there's a very strong identification with the state and with the army that's much ahead of the Ba'ath Party. My guess is that they have more support than Assad, although Assad's support is very strong and more than the Ba'ath Party. And if you remember, the Ba'ath Party basically conscripted Bashar al-Assad to the presidency when his father died, and that meant that he didn't have any other constituency really to change the system, although he was seen as a candidate of reform back in 2000. He didn't really have any other constituency than the Ba'ath Party at that time. Since then, I believe he has built some levels of constituency broader than the Ba'ath Party, and that has helped him take some initiatives against some of the cronyism and so on that's gone on within the system there. So he has to do that, of course, to maintain his own credibility. And there have been a number of mini crises like that you mentioned of the relative who killed someone that Syrians have had their eye very closely on.
I don't know how familiar you are with American politics, but it's kind of interesting that only one candidate, Senator Rand Paul, has actually concurred with you on this issue, saying that, that we're supporting, America, I should say, supporting people that are affiliated with the same people that bombed the World Trade Center. Even the liberal Bernie Sanders is the last debate was talking very low, along with Hillary Clinton, obviously, about Assad.
Yeah, I follow it to some extent, not to a great extent, because as you say, there's a great consensus, another Washington consensus about the role of what they call America in the world. As a student of Latin America, I tend to use, the United States rather than America. But, there is a great consensus about, the shining light on the hill, the role of the US in world affairs and being the moral leader of the world and so on, which is really a peculiarly North American thing. It's not really seen that way in most of the rest of the world. But it's good to see that there have been some voices. There's some Congress people. I think there's a Virginia senator and there's a Hawaiian.
Last week, Senator Richard Black. There's also Congresswoman from Hawaii, Tulsi Gabbard, in the federal Congress is a good voice.
So people with quite different political perspectives. But I think what's significant is they're using just some basic principles of ethics and international law to assess the situation. And it's not rocket science to me, that indeed it's even in the principles of the Geneva and Vienna talks that it's up to the Syrian people to decide their political system. That outside-funded terrorism is wrong and against international law. And, the people in North America the candidates for the presidential election need to stand back and reassess their situation. They're losing. And the great danger, I think, here now is that, and I remember the Vietnam War. I remember when the US was losing in the Vietnam War. It was very difficult and probably is very difficult for Washington to lose a war. They don't know how to do it. They obviously don't like it. They don't know how to do it well. And, the shocking thing is I still remember that there was almost a peace agreement 7 years before the Vietnam War ended. It was sabotaged by Kissinger and Nixon and so on for electoral reasons, But it will be a terrible, and then how many millions of people were killed after that in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and so on. It would be a tragedy if the internal politics of the US and their own silly ambitions really prolonged this conflict. Because as I see it, the US has lost its gambit on Syria. It's going to cost the US in the region quite a lot. But they can keep on killing people. There's the downside. They can keep on killing people. If they have the Saudis and Erdogan and Qatar, they can keep on arming terrorists and killing people in Iraq and Syria. Remember, Iraq's in play now too, that Iraq has really moved over onto the Syrian side, and that's a great challenge to the US role in the region. How is the US going to take this losing gambit that it's in on now is really going to matter a lot, not in terms of the future, because I think the future's been decided. The intervention of Russia, the unification of Iran, Iraq and Syria and the best part of Lebanon in resisting that process of regime change in Syria means that whole gambit across the region is lost. But how many more years, how many more lives is going to cost, that's very important.
Last week, kind of what you were saying about it already being decided, Senator Black told me, and I've never heard of this, but he said that Vladimir Putin actually watched the video of Colonel Gaddafi getting killed 3 times and was so appalled by that video that he pledged that he wouldn't let the same thing happen to Assad. Do you think that Russia, their change of heart, really, because, remember, in Libya, they did support the UN resolution. Do you think that they've kind of recognized the Arab Spring being a kind of non-organic democratic movement? Because, as a professor of international relations, you're probably familiar with political scientists referring to these democratic movements as waves. There's people saying that the Arab Spring is a 4th wave. Do you think that that's a legitimate thing to call it? These cliches are sort of sometimes exaggerated. There was a cedar revolution in Lebanon, and there was there have been color revolutions ever since the US got its monopoly on, or its control over the Security Council, I suppose. But in relation to the role of Russia, I think it is interesting. I'm sure Vladimir Putin was appalled at the murder of Muammar Gaddafi, but you have to remember too that the Salafist attacks on Syria were resisted by Syria. Syria resisted almost alone for over 4 years, and at the same time, Putin was gaining more experience in his statescraft. He had to be cautious, really, because there was a history of Soviet intervention behind him, and there was and his own domestic support is really based on him doing the right thing by the Russian people. And I think that's why the Russian intervention in Syria was phrased in terms of protecting Russia from, the 10,000 Russian citizens who were fighting in that region who were going to come back to Russia, and they've got their own history of terrorism, which is still very fresh in their minds. So he was understandably cautious about doing that, I think. But when
that intervention took place in September last year. It was done in, for example, a very different way to the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. There was a very strong coalition on the ground, not least involving Iran and Hezbollah, as well as a whole lot of coordinated Syrian militia. There was that history of the resistance that Syria hadn't been crushed by this war. And so, and Putin had matured also in the way that he'd seen his role in the region. So I think that, in the Arab Spring, there were very different experiences. The Egyptian experience was quite different to the Libyan experience, to the Syrian experience, So I don't think we need to agonise too much about grand sort of generalisations about what was going on in the whole region. Of course, there were links between those sorts of things, but as I say, the experiences were quite different. But the maturity of Putin in his coordination and intervention, and let's not forget the diplomacy that he's continuing to do. I call it like a blitzkrieg of diplomacy. He's talking to all of the players, Israel, Jordan, Turkey is another story now because that's damaged. The trust there has been damaged. But Qatar, recently he was talking to Qatar, So that broader intervention is a mature one from someone who's now got a lot of experience in international relations, who did not want a confrontation, still does not want a confrontation with the big powers. Indeed, he wants a confrontation with as few as possible. That's part of his maturity, isn't it? That when the Russian air power went into Syria, he'd already talked to Turkey. Okay, that fell over. He talked to Israel. He didn't want to take on Israel at the same time. He tried to minimise the enemies he was going in against. So I think that coordination was a very carefully done thing and a very unique in the context of Syria and Syria's own demonstrable capacity to resist.
So you mentioned Soviet intervention, and you're learned on South America, obviously. Sorry. So you mentioned that in Syria, and at the time in South America, a lot of that intervention, for example, in Nicaragua was by the Soviet Union was quite marginal, but it was used to justify American intervention. And a lot of what I see on the American media is, at the same time, this new intervention, which is obviously quite larger, they're using that as a ploy to say, okay, well, Russia's intervening here, we need to get involved as well. Do you think that Russia getting involved is going to push more American intervention, or do you think that there might be some diplomacy that follows now?
There's definitely diplomacy going on as we speak. I mean, President Putin has been very careful to keep his communications going with Washington. You notice that it's not a coincidence that a number of US politicians, including Donald Trump, for example, are now more or less, saying nice things about the Russian president, because the Russian president has aligned his aims with the stated aims of Washington. If they're not the real aims, that's another story. But the stated aims of Washington to fight terrorist groups. And they've gone in there and they've said, okay, we're going to expand the definition here. It's not just Al-Nusra and ISIS, it's also the Army of Islam and al-Sham. So, in other words, Mr. Putin has been cleverly using the Washington stated aims to align himself with their stated aims rather than in confrontation with them. It's not a North Korean sort of diplomacy that's going on out of Moscow. It's a different type of diplomacy. But interesting you mentioned Nicaragua. I mean, the other thing was Hollywood came in on that line back at the time. You remember there was a famous B-grade movie called Red Dawn, which was about Nicaragua invading the United States in the mid-80s, with Russian and Cuban support. Yeah. They had a new version of it with North Korea as the protagonist, but not that North Korea has ever got anything close to, invading the US. But, so that's what I fear, in the longer term, that if the propaganda war is not challenged, more seriously, Hollywood is going to be reinforcing these things that, the Syrian revolution was betrayed and so on. I still remember all of the endless films about Vietnam and, how the government betrayed the soldiers in Vietnam and so on. So they take it very badly. But, no, the role of Russia as a counterweight has been extremely important. But, that shouldn't obscure the fact that I think this is very significant. I try to make this point in the book, particularly at the end, that the one of the main reasons why the divisions have been able to be exacerbated, the sectarian card has been played by the agents of Washington, such as the Saudis and Qatar, is that the region is divided. It hasn't got strong regional organizations in the way that, for example, the late Hugo Chavez created in South America and Latin America, some very big regional organizations. As long as they're divided, Chavez used to refer to Bolivar, saying that we can't resist the big powers if we are all separate. We have to get together. And Fidel Castro said that, and so many Latin Americans said that. Now you have an enhanced axis of resistance, as they call it, which used to mean Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah, now includes Iraq. Iraq, of all places, which a lot of Western people assume had become a puppet of Washington, basically, has expressed a fair amount of political will recently against the fragmentation of the country, against the role of the Western oil monopolies in Iraq. Of course, there's Iraqi-Kurdish collaboration on that front, but now security collaboration with all of those neighbouring countries. And so all of the ground troops against all of the foreign armed groups in Syria are from all of those four countries, and even some from Afghanistan. And that seems to me to be very significant, because the role of Iraq, given the history of US intervention in Iraq, for example, the intelligence center that Russia is sharing with those four countries is based in Baghdad, but the US military is still based in Baghdad. And of course, Iraq still has a number of important ties that it can't break easily with the US, but Iraq has definitely is shifting, let's say, out of the US orbit into the orbit of the axis of resistance for obvious reasons of its own survival and its own security and its own existence.
You mentioned unity amongst groups trying to resist Washington. I think the most recent the Summit of the Americas, and there was a discussion of those countries not including the United States anymore. And, the United States opened relations with Cuba again, and people in America saw this as some great diplomatic goal achieved finally. But there's a lot of analysts, not mainstream ones, but they had said that, it was because the United States wanted to open itself more to its neighbors, and instead of taking this kind of trying to dominate the hemisphere, kind of be diplomatic. And so it seems, in fact, South America has actually prospered a lot more, a lot of those countries resisting Washington. Do you think that the Middle East, when all of this conflict is resolved, do you think that they will take that same step? Because you mentioned Iraq is doing that as well.
Yes, if you want my take on the move that Obama did with Cuba, they were forced to do that really because the regional unity organizations that were created by Hugo Chavez with Cuban support were firstly the left bloc, the ALBA group, which is about 11 countries, relatively small, but the Union of South American Countries, UNASUR, which now is the major force in helping resolve internal destabilization in South American countries, including Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia. And CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, that's the one without the US and Canada. The Summit of the Americas has more been associated with Pan-Americanism and controlled by Washington. So when Cuba was president of CELAC in 2013, really effectively the isolation of Cuba had been turned on its head, hadn't it? The US was effectively isolated. Cuba was the head of the biggest regional grouping there, CELAC at the time. So, of course, the other side to that is that the Obama initiative didn't really change US law. It hasn't changed US law yet. And so most of the sanctions against Cuba are still in place. It's a little bit like the Iranian situation where there's been a political agreement, but the likelihood of unilateral sanctions against Iran by the US is going to continue. What's made a difference with Iran is that now the Chinese and the Europeans and so on feel much more able to engage with and increase their investments in Iran, basically. So, yes, I think that there's an important lesson from the Latin American experience. It's still a way down the track with the Middle East, but I think that this unified struggle they're waging against the armed groups in Syria and Iraq also is going to be formative for them, basically. There are lots of hurdles in the way. Israel, not the least hurdle. Lebanon's sectarian constitution is another hurdle. But at least you see those four countries fighting together. For example, in Aleppo today, all of those four countries have significant militia in the north of Syria, despite the fact that Turkey is still very strongly supporting all of those terrorist groups, that the Arab countries and Iran have come together in that sort of enhanced axis of cooperation, and they've got Russia behind them. That's extremely significant for the region.
So do you see, I guess, this attempted isolation of Iran, do you see it kind of being the same situation, being turned on its head one day?
Yes, well, it's failed, really. I mean, after 14 or 15 years, remember, it took a long time. Remember, we were almost on the verge of a world war 5 years ago about Iran, the supposed threat from Iran's nuclear weapons. Now the new thing is, well, they're testing ballistic missiles. There's not going to be any end to that, more or less, because Washington's approach has been to try and, get submission out of all of these countries. If they can't get submission out of them, to balkanize them. Let's balkanize Iraq. Let's balkanize Syria. It's still being spoken of in my country as well as in North America. The idea of still trying to partition Syria. That's not going to happen. They've lost on that front too. The plan B has failed effectively. Baghdad and Damascus are showing significant separate political will to the US, and it's becoming very difficult for any partition plan in there. It's still in play because there's some sort of scheme going on with the Iraqi Kurds, which I have to admit I fail to completely understand, because they have some sort of deal with oil with Turkey, and obviously the majority of the Kurds in Turkey are not very happy with you would think they would be not very happy with this collaboration with the Iraqi Kurds and Turkey, but that's one of these Byzantine things that's rather difficult to see. But so there is still this attempt to weaken Baghdad by supporting a more autonomous state in the north of Iraq. But I think international law and Iraqi law has been against that so far, and Baghdad is very strongly against it. Baghdad wants to keep control of the resources of Iraq in its hands and build national institutions. So I think the balkanization plans have failed or are failing.
Really, what role do you think international law will have in these ensuing conflicts? 1986 in Nicaragua, the United States, Judge Schwiebel, in fact, in his dissent, which I thought was kind of hilarious, instead of addressing these claims against the United States, these flagrant violations of international law, just questioned the viability of Nicaragua to bring these claims against them. Really, do you see it kind of being the same situation one day, maybe, where before the United States is brought to trial, and then they are found guilty, and they stop showing up to court, and veto sanctions against themselves in the Security Council?
On international law, I think the criminal law, remember even in criminal law, that there has to be a search for internal solutions before there's a resort to international criminal law. So I think in this case, the actions within the US to use US law against US policymakers, for example, it's being pursued to some extent against Cheney and Bush over torture. I'm not sure what the position of past presidents is in the US under law, but there have been some actions over the torture allegations. In relation to Syria, though, I think international law beyond the criminal is important for the norms that it creates. You notice that it's not a coincidence that the talks in Geneva, the talks in Vienna, the talks in Moscow have constantly used international law as their basis, to refer to the right of the Syrian people to determine their own political system, for example. That's in terms of international human rights law as well as the Charter of the United Nations. In terms of the Charter of the United Nations, the territorial integrity of those countries of Iraq and Syria. So that's been an important reference point for the political consensus building over those sorts of talks. So in terms of criminal law, that's a more difficult course, and of course the powerful states are typically going to protect their own unless they're handed over, or unless there's some internal process that can be followed through. But international law has been very important. it's been an important reason why the credibility of the Russian president has been quite strong, because his intervention in Syria has been very strongly based on international law, and he's pointed it out at each stage of the game and contrasted it with the illegal interventions there. So in that sense, international law has been very important.
In your own country, in Australia, how has your parliament, executive, and the media, how has it been covering this war?
Well, pretty hopeless, really. There's very little dissent, unlike in the US, unlike in Britain, where you do have some, dissenting lawmakers. We've had very little of it here, basically. There's been trepidation, there's been hesitance, to commit to that barrier of international law of committing to a military operation in Syria has been a barrier that's weighed on some of their minds, really. But none of them have come out in the way that the Virginia senator and the Hawaiian congresswoman have. But the role of Iraq in inviting a coalition in there has opened the door for them to look more credible in what they're doing. But the media here has been really bad. It's been worse than the US and more controlled, more monopolised than in the US and in Britain, for example. And that's why my book's being published in Canada, for example.
All right. That was Dr. Tim Anderson at Sydney University. You can get his book, The Dirty War on Syria. I know it's available on ebook. How much is it?
$9.50 on Global Research site.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your interview, Tim.
Thanks for that.
Sign out.